Good afternoon and welcome to today's program at the International Center Goa. We are here for a book discussion on Dr. Selina Ho's Thirsty Cities. Selina, thank you very much for joining us. And Selina Ho is based at the National University of Singapore. She's an assistant professor in international affairs at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Selina specializes in Chinese politics and foreign policy with a focus on infrastructure politics and water disputes. Selina is the author of Thirsty Cities. I'll just read out the full title of the book. The first part itself is very, very catchy. So that's the part you tend to remember, Thirsty Cities. Social Contracts and Public Goods Provision in China and India, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. She's also the co-author of Rivers of Iron, Railroads and Chinese Power in Southeast Asia, published with the University of California Press in 2020, and co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of China-India Relations, also published in 2020. Selina was a Singaporean public servant for a fairly long time, before she went on to do her PhD from the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, or SAIS as it is known as, at the Johns Hopkins University. Earlier, she studied history at the National University of Singapore. Selina, once again, thank you so much for joining us, making time for this book discussion on, I thought it was a fabulous book to read, and I'll spell out why as we go along.
Thank you, Pushkar, for having me. Thanks for inviting me, and it's my pleasure to be here. And to everyone online, thank you for attending. I look forward to the discussion.
Let me begin with some introductory remarks before we go on to Selina's presentation. She'll be making a short 15 to 20 minute presentation on her book. This will be followed by a couple of questions that I'll have, as well as we'll take some audience questions. We'll try to end in about 50 to 60 minutes. The first thing I wanted to bring up is that China-India comparisons are scarce. However much we would like to believe that these are two of the largest countries in the world. There has been so much talk about global shift of power towards the east, and yet when you look at books that compare India and China, they are mostly limited to two disciplines. One, international relations, where people look at China and India from a security studies perspective or a strategic studies perspective. Foreign policy of India and China, that is something, you'll find a lot of writing on the subject. You also have a fairly large number of studies by economists. Now, basically, there's a lot of number crunching about what's going on in terms of economic growth, what's happening in terms of inequality in China and India, what's happening in terms of even public goods provision, the subject of Selina's book. What is lacking in the India-China literature largely is a comparison of China and India in terms of their internal aspects, the discipline of comparative politics. If you look at the literature, you have very, very few studies, maybe one or two, and Selina and I were earlier talking about it, which look at China and India from a comparative politics perspective. And that's strange. It's strange because, here you have two large populous countries, which are, everyone says, are going to count among the leading nations in the 21st century. And yet, Indians have not worked on what is happening inside China, not a great deal at least. And Chinese scholarship on India also does not take on that comparative framework to look at the two countries.
Right.
But let me begin with something very interesting from a journal article that appeared in 2000. I'm not going to name the authors or the article, but it's a widely cited article that was published in 2000, which looked at the welfare performance of democracies and dictatorships across the world. Now, what that study found was that democracies outperform dictatorships, with the exception of India and China. And I remember at that time, and even today, the thought that strikes me is that how can you have any credible theory in the social sciences if China and India are exceptions? Because they count as two units in terms of, comparisons in terms of the world of nation states, but we are really looking at 2.5 to 3 billion people in these two countries who have nothing to do with democracy or dictatorship advantage. So that's the reference point. The second thing that I already pointed out is that since the 2000s, there have been plenty of studies on India and China, but they are all mostly limited to international affairs or to economics. This brings me to my third point, which is that in many ways, Selina's book, Thirsty Cities, breaks new ground. Because in comparing and looking at welfare outcomes in the two countries, specifically water supply. Of course, the field research for that, the empirical work there is 2 cities in India and 2 cities in China. But that itself allows for some degree of generalization. She writes in her book that it's not as if water issues are not a challenge in China. It's not as if there are no problems. And you have similar kinds of problems in India, but why has China dealt better with these problems than India? So it's not about establishing anything like the dictatorships do better. It's simply about addressing this puzzle. How is it that, as a rule, it seems that democracies do better than dictatorships, but India and China are different? Let's look at what explains this difference. Right. So this is how I understood the book. This is how I read the book. And let me begin with a couple of very soft general questions, which are, to settle down as we settle down. First, and I'm really curious about this. What made you take up this India-China comparison? Because this is really an ambitious study.
Right. So, well, thank you for the introduction to the book, and very high praise. I really appreciate it. The China-India comparisons are not that plentiful as a field in comparative politics, as you correctly pointed out. But there is this growing interest in the last few years, and this a growing body of literature that actually does this kind of comparisons. And there are certain institutes around the world that actually focus on this. Particularly, I'm thinking not just of the institute that's in my school, the Center on Asia of Asia and Globalization, that is headed by Kanti Bajpai, but also the India-China Institute that is actually in New York University, headed by Mark Fraser. So these people, there is this growing interest, right? But it's not. You're definitely right in saying that there is still very limited comparative study. So why do I want to do it? And essentially, it's actually a really difficult task because studying China is hard enough, or studying India is hard enough. So doing comparison of the two is an even harder task, right? So I actually do it, for a combination of professional and personal reasons. Let me start with the personal ones because they're more straightforward. I'm from Singapore. I live most of my adult life in Singapore. It is natural to be very interested in the countries that are biggest in your neighborhood, right? You need to know them in order to, if you're interested in international relations, there's this natural inclination to know about the biggest countries in your neighborhood so that you know how their growth and their strengths will affect you. But in Singapore's case, a much, much smaller country. And then personally, I'm interested in issues like water. Singapore is water scarce. So it is actually a natural thing that, we grow up thinking about how to deal with our water problems. So those are some of the personal reasons. But professionally, there is actually great reasons to do China-India comparison. It is actually, this field is fertile ground for investigation into various aspects of comparative politics. There's so much things that you can talk about. There's a lot of convergence and divergence between China and India, similarities and differences, and these are the things that make good comparisons. Some people say that you can't really compare the two because very different political systems, very different types of problems. But actually, that is not entirely true. It is possible to compare because there are some similarities. In this case, in my book, I'm writing about mostly it's about cities, urbanization, right? So the two countries actually have the most rapid rate of periods. The most rapid rate or periods of urbanization are actually happening in China, India. So this is a very valid way of looking at China-India comparative studies. And the other reason is rising powers. You should, it is somewhat linked to the personal reason, but more broadly speaking, even if you're not from this region, as rising powers, you need to know about these two countries. You should be curious about why, certain phenomena that you observe in the two countries and whether they are comparable, and the kind of problems that they face. Very similar problems. I mean, water scarcity is a problem for both countries. It is not like it is not a problem. And, they have to deal with large populations. These are all things that can affect the ability of countries to rise, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that it's just natural, I think pretty natural for me to want to do this kind of comparison. Although I must say that, I am a China specialist to begin with. So, I wouldn't claim to be an India specialist. So I hope to learn from the audience today as well. And from you, of course, Pushkar. Yeah.
Thank you, Selina. A related question, another question which is closely related to the first is, of course, when you look at India, the most of the research on India by outsiders is being done in the past by Western academics, and over time, of course, with more and more South Asians studying abroad, whether in the US or whether in Europe or elsewhere, going back to study India. I'm just trying to think of, do you know of anybody from Singapore, for example, who has looked at India's domestic politics? I cannot immediately recall. You may have people of Indian origin who are based at the National University of Singapore or elsewhere who are doing good work on India. But really, it's very, very strange that you do not have even, say, Indian scholars who are based in the US. How many of them have ventured to study China? I think very few. So even in that sense, your book is a fantastic achievement. Your research is a fantastic achievement. So the question here is this: as a Singaporean, as an East Asian, what kind of difficulties did you experience? And I'm quite aware that because your research is limited to 2 cities, and at the city level, doing that research is relatively easier than, say, in the countryside. But what kind of difficulties did you experience in doing research in New Delhi and Hyderabad?
Okay, so well, I have to say that, in response to something that you just said just now, I think as a Singaporean, one of the greatest advantage I have is I actually come from multicultural background. We have Indians here in Singapore, and Chinese and Malays, right? So in a sense, Indian culture is not alien to me, right? Although you can't really say that there is actually one culture because India is so diverse. But at least in terms of food, there's some similarities. Understanding of how things work generally is not that alien. So and as a Singaporean, I provide an objective viewpoint. If you have a China person studying China, India person studying India, people might question how subjective or objective your point of view is. As a Singaporean, I think I bring with it more credibility in coming up with a more objective view. So what are some of the difficulties that I face? And you're correct in pointing out the cities are a lot easier to maneuver than, say, if I were to go to the countryside. I've actually been to the northeast of India, to Dibrugarh in Assam, basically because I also work on the Brahmaputra issue. And it's a lot more challenging. I remember I was in a bone shaker of a 4-wheel drive car, and it was the whole day my bones were shaking because we were going through the northern banks of the Brahmaputra where the minorities lived, and I was being shaken by the car. But those are small problems. I mean, I wasn't long in the northeast or anything. My field work in India is based on 2 large cities, so it's a lot easier. But still, I think there are some certain problems, but it would not be. I don't think of them as insurmountable, right? One way is that there's a vast array of people, of institutions, right? So one of the things is you have to find the right people to speak to. So one way to overcome that is, one good thing is that the LKY school, Lee Kuan Yew School, actually has a lot of Indian professors and Indian students as well. So one way is to get in touch with alumni, arranging meetings with alumni. We have people who come to study in Singapore from the administrative service in India, and all that kind of connections help in finding out who are the right people to speak to, gaining access, right? So I mean, these are the kind of difficulty. Who want to speak to somebody from Singapore who they don't know? So having some form of connection and access, and through students, through other professors, that definitely helped to overcome this problem. So again. So I think that is actually the key problem, and logistics as well. In a sense, I have an RA at the time, a research assistant at the time, who actually is doing his PhD now in NUS. But at the time, he accompanied me on the trip. That makes things a lot easier. He arranged all the logistics. Logistics could be a nightmare for me because I wouldn't know how to travel from one area to another, probably get lost or something. But he arranged the logistics, and that really helped a lot. So I think that in general, is this kind of a problem. It's more of a logistical, knowing where to assess, knowing where to go, because there's a huge confusing array of institutions and people that I would like to meet, and getting to the right people is a challenge. Yeah.
Thanks, Selina. Your book, it's simply, what it does is it moves away from the democracy versus dictatorship debate, which people, and there's plenty of literature on that, whether democracies outperform dictatorships in terms of economic growth, the different kinds of welfare outcomes, human development more generally, and so on. And what you instead do is say that, no, what matters is a social contract, the relationship between state and society,
right,
between citizens and the state.
Right.
So what we are going to do now is what we discussed earlier is that you will have a short presentation on the book, about 15 to 20 minutes. And once we are through that presentation, I'll have some more questions. We'll look at the time at that, at that juncture. And then we'll also take some audience questions after the presentation. Okay, Selina.
Sure. So let me share our screen so that people can find it easier to follow the presentation. So basically, the title of the book, this is the cover of the book, Thirsty Cities, Social Contracts and Public Goods Provision in China, India. So, as Pushkar have already mentioned just now, there are all these common assumptions about democracies and producing more public goods than authoritarian systems. And the reasoning that has been put forth is that because democracies need to win elections, they have a longer time horizon, meaning that that people who are elected will want to stay in power for a longer period of time. So in order to do this, they need to appeal to a larger group of people. So when you do that, the tendency is therefore to produce more public goods than private goods or club goods, right? So this is usually done by large N statistical studies. So they do all these statistics, running all these statistics, and they found that democracies produce more public goods than authoritarian systems. But the problem with this assumption, there is a very large puzzle here. Why is it that authoritarian China is better at producing public goods than democratic India? This is a very large anomaly. I mean, as Pushkar correctly pointed out, the two largest countries in the whole world, and there's this anomaly that is not democratic India producing more public goods than authoritarian China, but the other way around. So there are people who try to explain this from various viewpoints. From economic viewpoint, saying that higher levels of economic development in China should lead to more producing public goods. Now, that's true to some extent. If you have higher GDP, you have greater wealth. But then there are all these other states that they can be wealthy, but it's very easy for these kind of wealthy states for their resources to be appropriated by corrupt people. If you think about something called the resource curse, right, in African countries, you can think about even in certain countries, there's really no guarantee. No, what guarantees that just because you have higher levels of economic development means that you will produce more for the public. Not necessary, right? There has to be a certain ethos, a normative quality that's involved in wanting to produce public goods. The belief in that public goods provision is the right thing to do. So why? So what I propose here in this book is that we need to move away from regime types to look at public goods. And there's something that one can consider and to explore. We need to look at, something called a social contract, but I will come to that in a bit. So I want to show some evidence to what I'm saying. Why is it that, that China actually produced more public goods? Why am I saying this is the evidence? The evidence is here, you can see this HDI, the Human Development Index, as produced by the UNDP. And it measures several things like how many years of schooling, the mean years of schooling, the mortality rate, and things like health, GNP, and comparison through the years, you can see that China has consistently stayed ahead of India. And if you were to focus just on the urban water sector itself, these figures also tell you something, right? So these are national level figures, right? Of course. So we'll come down to the city level in a second. So here, the service level benchmark is actually set by the Indian government, the Ministry of Urban Development. Okay, and the 2009 figure is by the Ministry of Urban Development, while the 2011 figures are from World Bank. They're not directly comparable, but you can sort of get an idea of how things are going. And if you look at from 2009 to 2011, the situation seems to have worsened, except for quality of water supply, it rose slightly, and extent of non-revenue water. This actually, is the water that has been lost through stealing from the pipes, from leakage or things like that. So, it's improved slightly, so it's lesser, right? So only 2 improvements in these 2 areas, minor improvements. But the other things have actually worsened, and you're very far away from the benchmarks that have been set by the Ministry of Urban Development. Now, if you look at the Chinese urban sector, these figures are from the World Bank, as well as the Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development in China. You have almost 100% water coverage in urban areas. Water production is pretty high, and water loss, proportion of water loss, again, that's almost equivalent to the extent of non-revenue water. Okay, how did that jump? It is actually pretty low at 13.09%. Okay, so then, so what I propose is, this puzzle. What is the answer to this puzzle? Let us move away from regime types and look at something a lot more fundamental, known as the social contract. And my argument is this very simple diagram here, which is that a social contract, what type of social contract, what is in the social contract impacts the institutional autonomy and capacity of those agencies, those institutions, government institutions that are involved in the provision of public goods. And that will have a attendant outcome, which is the public goods provision, whether it's higher or lower. So, the idea of a social contract, for people who are familiar with political philosophy, you're familiar with the work of Hobbes, with Rousseau, and with Locke, and you know that they talk about, government and the social contract. So basically, what is a social contract? It is an agreement between the state and society. So I'm actually proposing moving to something very fundamental. What is the relationship between the state and the society? What is the relationship between the governed and the governor, the ruler and the ruled, right? So here it's an agreement between state and society. And in this agreement, citizens actually consent, give up certain rights to the governments in exchange for an obligation to provide for them. So this is the responsibility of the government. And in return, so the citizens give up some of their own rights to the government in order to get this in exchange. So in a sense, a social contract is formed when the basis of government legitimacy is in line with what people expect from the government. Okay, so this is drawn from the work of traditional political philosophers. But what I did was I made an innovation. I think of social contracts as an informal institutions. For those of you who are familiar with comparative politics, we know that institutions can be formal and informal. So informal institutions can be things like, norms and values, and in social contract, you can think of it as a very large informal institutions. So why do I say that they are informal institutions? Well, they are institutions because they act like institutions. They shape state-society interactions. They constrain governments, meaning that governments have to act according to the institution of a social contract in order to stay in power. Otherwise, they may get voted out. They may get purged. They might have a coup. It can turn very violent for the government if they do not keep to the social contract. I mean, no, it's an institution because there are these repeated patterns of behavior. This is what institutions do. Institutions cut down transaction costs because you expect certain behavior to recur. And institutions are sticky, meaning that it's very resistant to change. We know that a social contract is that it's slow to change and slow to evolve. Now, it's informal. Why is it informal? It's informal because it's not written, it's implicit. It's not legally binding and does not require ratification by any legislative body. But we know that they exist because we can see can see the existence of social contract in a country's constitutions, the laws and policies, official statements, and the political discourses and narratives that come out from government. So if you think about the U.S. Constitution, the Constitution of the United States of America, it's been described as a lock-in constitution. So you can imagine what it brings to the idea of social contract brings the idea of the constitution, right? So let me turn to my focusing on China. Just to state up front, I actually have 4 case studies in the book, and 2 from China. One is Beijing, the other is Shenzhen. And in India, I have New Delhi and Hyderabad. I'll be speaking on 2 case studies, Shenzhen in China and Hyderabad for India. So let me start by saying, in the Chinese social contract, what is in the Chinese social contract? Basically, I call it a performance-based social contract. And by performance, I don't just mean in material forms, but also in normative forms. It's moral. It is based on the idea of a mandate of heaven. So you can trace these ideas about, the mandate of heaven, you can think of it as a social contract. It's just that the Chinese never use the terms mandate, a social contract. But if you think about the idea of mandate of heaven, what does it mean? It means that the emperor is allowed to stay in power as long as he provides for the people, right? So this is, again, reciprocal. It is an exchange. The idea of a social contract is there. It doesn't have to be called a social contract to be a social contract. It is a mandate of heaven is a form of social contract. And it continues to be relevant to the CCP government today, to Xi Jinping's government. Primarily, you can see in the way that they deal with anti-corruption. Corruption, large-scale anti-corruption campaigns that focus on economic growth and public goods provision. These are all. These tell you that they are very much focused on performance, because if they don't deliver the goods, then you know that there will be social chaos and disorder, right, coming up. Now, the characteristic of the Chinese social contract is also urban. Why urban? Because the agreement is actually really with the workers in the city. There is a strong urban bias, basically, and although China and India were rural countries, the Chinese urban population has actually overtaken the rural population. The agreement is with the workers because for authoritarian systems, the stability of cities is very important. If they do not cater to the workers, that's where collective action can take place, protests can take place. So cities need to be stable. So this emphasis on performance actually grants formal state institutions extensive rights and autonomy. This is particularly true at the local government level. That's why I was studying cities, to show this is the case. And it also necessitates the construction of infrastructure and public goods. And I argue that in the end, it leads to a high level of public goods being produced. Now, looking at the case of Shenzhen, this is definitely being borne out. You have China's social contract leading to institutional autonomy and capacity. Shenzhen was designated as an SEZ, a special economic zone, in 1979 when China opened up. It was given a lot of autonomy to set laws and regulations. And then in the process, as early as 1993, Shenzhen set up an independent water authority known as Shenzhen Water Affairs Bureau. And this is the first of its kind in the entire of China. Okay, in all the cities in China, this is the very first time, the first of its own that was built, that was set up, an independent water authority. It has operational autonomy. There was a separation of government and enterprise. The Shenzhen Water Group, a very large water group in China, became a joint venture in 2004. And government investments, in the water sector actually quadrupled from 2005 to 2009. So this is actually from the local government having a lot of say in how things are done and all that. I can talk about that a bit more later on if there are questions on it. So in Shenzhen, what do we see in the end? We see this impaired institutional autonomy and capacity leading to greater efficiency and coordination, strengthened regulation and oversight, and improvement in the performance of the Shenzhen Water Group. And, it was even praised by the ADB in this report that I have on the screen here, that, it was praised for having one of the most complete legal framework for the kind of stuff that they do for the water sector in Shenzhen. And you can see this performance improvement in the water sector. Water production rose very rapidly from 1991, before the Central Water Affairs Bureau was built, to 2.58 million cubic meters in 1995. And water supply per capita per day is higher than the national average, while water loss is very low. The gray line in the chart there shows you the water loss in Shenzhen, and it's very low, below the national average, actually. So let's turn to the India social contract. So what is within the India social contract? What would you consider to be within the India social? What is the agreement between the government and the people? So I would actually say that one way of looking at this is to see what happened after independence. In the sense that you can only think about a social contract when there is actually a unitary government that came into place. So the emphasis on socialism came about during the Nehru years. I mean, Nehru himself was one of the was a socialist, right? So he advocated state ownership in a welfare state. Now, the problem with socialism is that it's actually a lot more easier to nationalize industries, right, than to create a welfare state, especially for a country that is poor. So in lieu of welfare state, one of the things that happened was populism resulted, right? If you cannot produce a welfare state, one way is to use populist tactics to appeal to the people. This Roti Kapda Aur Makanan was popularized by Indira Gandhi. The other reason why populism came about was something that Atul Kohli, who is actually from Princeton University, a scholar from Princeton, Atul Kohli, actually talked about how universal suffrage actually came to India at a time where before it was industrialized. It hasn't been industrialized yet, but universal suffrage came. So what happened was that all the traditional patronage networks at the grassroots level, at the village level, all rose to the level of the state and to the national government. So all these traditional patronage networks leads to this populist kind of appeals. And you can see it continuing to these days. Electoral cycles, you see, politicians promising free electricity, free water, which is not sustainable if you really want to keep them going, right? There's a rural bias given the large rural population in India, and this is manifested in things like loans, subsidies, higher agricultural prices. So socialism actually emphasizes state ownership and central planning. This result in a very strong central government vis-a-vis the local government. So local governments, even though they are supposed to be the one that's involved in public goods provision, in control of the water sector, they actually do not have the funding for it. The CAA, the amendment, Constitutional Amendment Act, actually did really nothing much in devolving power to the local governments when it comes to be implemented. The central government continues to hold the budget and the purse strings and the power and the resources in these areas. And populism itself actually weakens institutions. It makes institutions easy to be captured by political interests and diverts resources away from public goods provision. So let me talk a little bit about this person. I think he's a very well-known politician in the country. He's actually well-known in Singapore too, Chandrababu Naidu, the chief minister of Andhra Pradesh in those years that are indicated on the slide. Obviously, there's now Telangana state, so he's now the chief minister of Telangana state. But in 2004, he actually lost power in Andhra Pradesh. He's known to be someone who has janus-faced tendencies, has been described as such. And, you know, you can see his populist slogan there: society is our temple, people are our gods, people first is our mantra. So what I argue in this case is that India's social contract actually constrains and modifies the behavior and the policies of leaders. Politicians often hide behind a veneer of populism while they try in, you know, much more secretly, not secretly, but a bit more, you know, under the radar in terms of trying to implement tougher economic reforms. So you see this being played out in Hyderabad. With the reforming of the, reforming of the Hyderabad Metropolitan Water Supply and Sewage Board. So one of the things that Naidu tried to do was to use technology to promote growth and to reform institutions. And Hyderabad is where he used to do all these things, right? Hyderabad is this technological high-tech state that's surrounded by a large rural population. It is very different from the areas that surround it, right? So he used technology to reform public services, computerization, and using and transforming the customer service of the HMWSSB. So when these reforms were actually really successful. So when he was elected for a second term in 1999, he tried to privatize the HMWSSB. Now, this is when it failed completely. There were all these strikes and protests that were organized by opposition parties, and even from his own party, there are people who went up against him. And then in June 2002, the HMWSSB officially stopped all privatization efforts. So the question to ask here is, why did customer service reforms work, but not the privatization of the HMWSSB? So my argument is that it demonstrates two things. It demonstrates enabling effect of the social contract, as well as a constraining effect of the social contract. Enabling because, you know, improving customer service in the way that he did it entails little cost to the people. It was popular. You know, it's a good thing. I think it's a really wonderful thing that, you know, improve customer service, but it's more of a popular kind of thing to do. The harder reforms were harder to carry out. And this is the constraining effect of the social contract. Populism, you know, so Naidu have to downplay all these economic reforms and emphasize social welfare policies. Socialism and this very large anti-privatization, very prominent anti-privatization narrative in India in general, but in Hyderabad as well. And, you know, Naidu was accused of surrendering Andhra Pradesh's economic sovereignty to the World Bank. There is definitely a rural bias in resource allocation. As I was saying just now, Hyderabad is, you know, in its high-tech city surrounded by a very rural population. So that was one other constraining factor. Now, this is my last slide. And, you know, one of the things that I tried to do in my conclusion was to talk about the policy implications of my study. What does all these mean? Can social contracts change? And, you know, I don't want to fall into the trap of following what, you know, cultural determinism, right? Just following a certain path dependencies. Just because the social contract is like that, it means you're doomed to a certain way of your country will be doomed to a certain path. That's not true. I say that yes, but the conditions for changing, it's going to be slow. And it's going to take a lot of effort, political will on the part of politicians. And I also think that whatever the changes are in the social contract, it has to have universal appeal and fit with the norms and the values of that society that is situated in. And in looking forward, I actually think that what Xi Jinping is doing in China now, where he bypassed institutions and keep all power to himself, I think that's a very dangerous thing in terms of public goods provision. I mean, we'll see how that plays out in the years ahead. Because if institutions become, you know, he's populist, if institutions become captured by political interests, and, you know, this could have implications on public goods provision. And I also think that in India's case, there's tremendous resources, tremendous values and the ideals of democracy, you know, they are really highly compatible with public goods provision. So the ideas are there. How do you shape the social contract to reflect those ideas? I think that's the question that needs to be answered by Indian politicians and government. My final point is that in a world of disruptions, social contracts are more relevant than ever, especially with the COVID pandemic that's going on. I think that it's very clear, you know, people start questioning the social contract. All these criticisms of governments and their failures to act, it has happened to almost every country. almost every country has to go through this. There's criticisms from people and they talking about how social contracts have been proven, have been broken. And it's not just restricted to pandemic. Even before that, the anti-globalization movement and all these. So it's a social contract broken. So we need to know, in order to know whether, how do we reform the social contract? How do we have a new social contract? We need to know what social contracts are. And you need to know what your country's social contracts are in order to move forward. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion. Pushkar, back to you.
Thanks, Selina. I think you'll have to stop sharing the slide.
Okay.
Okay, I can do that.
Okay, yeah. No, I'm fine.
Yeah.
Thanks for the reminder.
So the first question actually is something very basic, and I think that would also be of interest to most people who are watching us. Where do social contracts come from? I mean, the way I would see it, for example, is that India is a practicing democracy, has been a practicing democracy since 1947, after the first elections in 1950, and you have the constitution as a reference point. And state-society relations are not fixed; they are always evolving through legislation as well as through informal set of rules. So that relationship is not something fixed; it is something changing, and we have talked a little bit about that. But say, for example, so India is a practicing democracy, China is a practicing communist regime, a dictatorship, and they would give birth to different kinds of social contracts. It would not just depend on what they inherited by way of culture or history or something else. One way to perhaps look at why these two countries have performed differently, and this is an old argument, which is that countries that do not provide X kind of public goods or X kind of goods compensate for that by providing more of Y kind of goods. So if you have an authoritarian system where you do not have political rights as we know it in the liberal democracies around the world, you compensate for that by providing more social goods. And you push, and at least from the point of view of the state, you try to construct a social contract which says that, well, what kind of freedoms matter? Why not economic freedom? Why should economic freedom matter more than political freedom, right? So the social contract, through that negotiation that takes place as a country practices democracy or dictatorship, that gives birth to a particular kind of social contract. Now, in India's case, my understanding is that where this social contract has come to mean that over a period of time, election after election, and one political party after another, whether at the national level or the state level, citizens have come to believe that certain public goods will not be provided by the state, however hard they try, because it is that engagement between state and society. And that kind of engagement does take place in China too, although in a different manner. Social protests are common in China too. It's not as if, we would like to believe that because it's an authoritarian regime, there are no social protests. There are.
Yeah.
So if there is no expectation from the state that the state will provide X or Y public goods, you start to look for private options. And that is what has happened in India today. Yes. So whether it is water, whether it is health, whether it is education, you simply have anyone with a little bit of income, will send their child to a private school. You do not have public water supply. What you do is, you dig a hole.
And tanks, storage tanks in middle income households, very common in India. Yeah.
So when you talk about social contract in these two countries, it is the practice of that different kind of regime. So ultimately what I'm getting at is perhaps regime type matters, but not in the way that we understand it. It's not about elections making a difference. It's about the kind of social contract that repeated elections produce or do not produce.
Right. So actually, so I mean, I certainly see your point when you talk about authoritarian systems. If there is ideologically, you can't give rights, so you give goods, right? But that's actually not true. The people who have actually studied authoritarian systems actually see that dictatorships result in things known as result in this phenomenon of a roving bandit, right? That's part of the comparative politics literature. People who come in and they try and get as much as they can from the system, and then they leave. You can see a lot of that in Africa. And you can see that in a lot in Africa. And so you can see that it's not true. The authoritarian systems need to produce a lot of public goods. In fact, rent-seeking behavior is very much associated with authoritarian systems. So they want to accumulate all these goods, these resources for themselves, so that they can enrich themselves and their supporters, to ensure the supporters will stay with them. So this is one of the arguments that these people who talk about regime types who say that authoritarian systems actually don't produce public goods for these kind of reasons: roving bandits, rent-seeking behavior, and things like that. So this is my counter to the point that authoritarian systems is a unique phenomenon to China in that sense, but it's also a unique phenomenon to, you can also see it actually in the Gulf monarchies, right? There are very high level of high level of public goods being produced in those countries. All these kings, if they want, they can keep all the oil resources themselves. So why do they provide? There has to be something else for wanting to provide all these public goods. Obviously, making sure that the population doesn't riot against the king and ensure the longevity of the regime. That's definitely one of the cases. That's why we talk about regime legitimacy. But so I'm talking about a social contract here. What is this agreement? It must be that authoritarian system saying that you keep quiet. I agree with you. We have this agreement. You keep quiet. You don't stir up trouble. You don't. But as long as I give you the things that will make your life comfortable. But these are unique. They're not necessarily what most authoritarian systems do. Most of them do rent-seeking behavior, roving bandits, and that kind of stuff. So this is actually what I'm saying. It's not systems. It's about it's not about whether it's authoritarian or democracies, regime types, but rather on the kind of understanding that government has with its people. Okay, so you actually start off with a question of where do social contracts come from, and in my book I actually trace historically to the social contracts. In China you can see this coming up from the Mandate of Heaven, which I was talking about just now, and it went right back to the beginning of the dynastic times, during to the Zhou dynasty, where the idea of a Mandate of Heaven: if you do not do right by the people, if there are natural disasters, if the granaries are not full, you as a king, you have lost the Mandate of Heaven. So the idea of a benevolent emperor. In India, actually, I mostly trace it back to post-independence India. Nehru came in power with his ideas of socialism and coming forth of democracy. But you can actually trace a part of it going back to to ideas that exist in the idea of the king, of what the Dharma that the king has. And you can find it in the works of Kautilya that talks about what the king should do in providing for the people. He should be thinking about the happiness of the people. So those are ideas there. It's just that India was not a unitary state until the British came. So the idea of a social contract is harder to pin down before that, before a modern state is formed. So that was what I was actually saying.
So in a sense, what you had, because you had so many different states, what you had is a more fragmented kind of social contract, where you had these little kingdoms here and there, and people and the state were connected, but that connection was different across the Indian subcontinent.
So my idea of a social contract is actually at a very much national level kind of thing.
Okay.
So the evidence that I have used is first tier cities in both countries. My reasoning for first tier cities is, if first tier cities can't do it, then what would be second, third tiers and fourth tier cities? They will have it worse. So that's why I picked the first tier cities. But the idea of a social contract that I have here is at the national level. Obviously, there's some variations across, right? They are not, the variations are going to be, you can say that Kerala Goa, and and Tamil Nadu actually do a lot better in public goods provision. But here, I'm trying to take the national average here. Okay, yeah.
Selina, there is a very, very interesting audience question from Mr. Ashok Chowdhury. He asks, I mean, and it's a very interesting question because what he says is, how did the social contract in China change from the pre-1980 period and after? And of course, you have the opening up of the economy. I mean, China takes up, extensive economic reforms and so on. Economic growth takes off. Before that, China is a low growth economy. So, how did the social contract change? I mean, what brought it about? What was the nature of that change?
Yeah, so as I was talking in chapter 3 of my book, I actually traced the social contract from the dynastic times and how it evolved over time through the Mao period and then to the current day with Deng Xiaoping opening up and all. So I actually I make the case that there's always been a performance-based social contract. In different forms, the idea of mandate of heaven in the beginning, and that mandate of heaven continues because, the Chinese people talk about the mandate of heaven, the CCP has lost its mandate of heaven when the Tangshan earthquake happened, right? When there were any natural disasters, actually people talk about about mandate of heaven, okay? So what I actually argued in my book is that during the Mao period, it was an anomaly. I call it the ideological interregnum, where ideology was the social contract. But then, because it doesn't fit well with the Chinese society and its values, it actually was only a short period of time before it went back to the performance-based social contract. So that was what I was saying. I actually traced it from the beginning. Yes, evolved. There was short periods of disruptions, but it went back because this is how resistance the social contract is. Norms and values are actually very slow to move. They do change, but it's very slow and sticky. That was the point I was making. Did I answer the question? I hope I did.
Yeah. We have a few questions which are more about, again, China's various river projects and how, again, the security, strategic studies, the implications in that respect. I'll leave those questions out. I mean, this is also for those watching because limiting ourselves to discussing Selina's book on thirsty cities. But there's one question which I'm going to ask. This is from Dr. Nand Kumar Kamath here at Goa University. He asks, and I'm rephrasing it a little bit, is that China has extensive water problems of its own.
Yes, absolutely.
And he writes that in Shanghai, according to what he has found, 85% of the water in the city's major rivers were undrinkable in 2015, according to official standards, and 56.4% was unfit for any purpose. It's a good observation. I mean, I don't know if it's correct or not. Maybe you can confirm that. But again, I think your book in the introduction itself, and I found that very, very, I think it was important to put it there because, most people, and we are Indians are, we get a little passionate about these India-China comparisons and relationships. And, sure, that's important. But, I think that paragraph there is that China has all kinds of water problems of its own. Yeah. And it is not as if it does not have its water challenges. They're huge. It's only what you're trying to do in your book is how has China dealt with it and how it appears to be, for the most part, better than how India has dealt with it. So it's a very modest attempt at, looking at the water situation in both countries and how the two countries have dealt with it. I think that observation, that question, I'm sort of answering on your behalf. I don't think
but maybe I could add, Pushkar. I think I want to make it very clear because the audience if you haven't had a chance to read the book, is that I'm not in any way an advocate of the Chinese system. Okay, not the authoritarian system. Okay, I'm a believer in democracy, and I think that there's a lot of there's wonderful things about India, which is that it is the largest democracy. In fact, I think of the institution, that one institution that you have, which I think is a big deal, the election commission, precisely because your social contract bases so much on voting and democratic rights. You have a very good and fair an independent election commission, right? So it does tell me that institutions want to work in India, you can, right? It's a matter of political will, where you want to put your resources in. And by putting all your resources in making the independent, election commission independent and fair, you're actually telling us, you're telling me, that proves my point, that the social contract is based on democracy, but it is in a way, it became populist because of the way that democracy has developed in India. And that is a problem that actually needs to be dealt with in order to, for some of these things to be rectified. And I want to make it very clear that, I acknowledge several times in the book that it's not that China does not have any problems. It's about relativity. And, if you talk about Shanghai, there's a Suzhou Creek, right? It was so dirty and so terrible before, but they actually managed to clean it up. So pollution is a huge problem in in China. You have Lanzhou, where benzene has leaked into the pipes and, went into the residents' homes. It was such a big fuckus at that time. It created such a big hoo-ha, and these problems exist. But what I'm saying is that overall, right, things are much better if you turn on the tap in China. If you want to drink water, it's clean and it's there. You don't have to look for private solutions the way that the middle class in India has to. They have their own water storage. They look at the water mafia. I talk about the water mafia in my book too. I mean, I enjoyed working on that part. I thought it was fascinating, and all that. So that's actually my response.
Selena, before I forget, in fact, one of the things I think you should try and do is really, because the book has been published by Cambridge University Press, and it's an expensive book. I mean, if you convert it in Indian rupees, I think many more people will read it and understand it. I mean, if there's an Indian edition, I mean, you should definitely be looking at asking your publisher to see if they can, sell the rights to local publishers, so that it costs around 2,000 rupees, which is a lot of money. And usually books published in India, and there are plenty, published by Cambridge or Oxford or whichever Princeton University Press, the Indian edition comes out in collaboration with a local publisher, and it's more easily available because, many times questions or observations about India or China, the general ones, I'm looking at some of the questions, and of course they are not. I mean, the program we have today is organized around your book rather than, larger questions about India and China. So you must consider, look at, the possibility of getting an Indian edition.
Do you had the hard copy version? Am I right?
No, what I have is I downloaded a copy.
Oh, okay. So
I have a PDF version.
I actually have the softback version now. Softback version, which is actually a lot cheaper. I did think about possibly an Indian edition, but I need to check with my editor in Cambridge University Press for that. Yeah.
They do publish a lot of books. Initially published by Cambridge, New York, and then you have the Indian edition.
Yeah.
And since this book is partly about India, at least one half of the book is about India, I think an Indian edition would be very good. There's another interesting question, and which is about the process of water management in China and India. There are two things which are very different, at least when we look at the kind of, again, I'm sorry, I have to get back to regimes. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, I mean, before we came online, is that India as a democracy experiences widespread social protest on just about every issue. In fact, it's pretty much a protest society,
No, this is exactly, again, part of why I say the Indian social contract is such, because it's about democracy and the rights and the ideals that come with it. But in a sort of a deviant form now because of the populist angle to it. Yeah.
So it's a messy democracy, right? I mean, that's the term which is often used for it. Now, for any government project pertaining to water, building of dams, building of something or the other, land comes into question.
Right.
and decision making implementation is typically a very, very slow process, because you cannot steamroll citizens. You simply can't ignore them, right? Now, what I do know from my readings on China is that social protests do take place in China. They have increased in frequency. They take place in small towns here and there, except that the nature of social protests is different. So this question is pretty much about asking whether does China even allow social protests against government projects involving water management?
Okay, let me say that there are two particular areas. I mean, this is before Xi Jinping. Okay, Xi Jinping's era is a difficult one because he had tightened control over a lot of different things. But you can find social protests on social media, just to point it out. And the Chinese citizens have a lot of ways of going around the restrictions imposed on social media. But before Xi Jinping came into power, there are actually one particular area of social protest which the Chinese government actually allows, and that is in the area of environmental issues, environmental governance. And the other one is when it involves corruption of local citizens. They actually encourage reporting of this corrupt behavior at the local level. You can send in petitions on these, and they actually will, examine it, right? So that kind of why do the Chinese government allow these particular areas? They see these kind of protests as a social safety valve in areas that they are interested in fixing. They become a form of pressure on local government to fix corruption, on environmental issues. And it also allows, because it's an authoritarian system, it becomes a safety valve. If you close off protests completely, you're going to have a very explosive situation. So this, by allowing certain types of protests to take place against environmental governments, against corruption, you actually it's a safety valve. You slowly release the pressure, and then so that it doesn't spill over into protests against the CCP itself, right? So there are social protests, in certain areas, but they are limited. You definitely don't see that in the case of what happens in India.
Thanks, Selina. Do you have a next book that you're working on?
No. Also, I've got a second book on Rivers of Iron, that's about China and Southeast Asia. I actually work on both comparative politics and IR.
Yeah.
And I do talk about China, India a little bit as well, but basically mostly from the Brahmaputra angle, right? Very well aware of the kind of what's happened with the Gawan issue and the Dokkum crisis, and how water has been used as a leverage in these instances. So it's actually very surprising behavior in China's part, because China has been has been trying to move away from coercion when it comes to water issues, at least with its water disputes with the Southeast Asian countries, the Mekong, and then with Kazakhstan. It has not adopted coercion, except for India. And that has to do with the border clashes. And a border issue. So there's a different ballgame altogether. So my interest is in this area. I am not actually working on a book per se, because I'm trying to write all these articles, but I'm working on several issues on the water disputes, publications in the area. I'm writing something about the competition between the United States and China and how that's playing out in East Asia. So mostly articles in these forms. So, and then later on, I'll go back to books. There is certain things that I need to do in order to get tenure in US. And publications of journals are actually quite important too.
I recall we first got in touch in the pre-COVID period, and that time I was actually exploring the possibility of bringing you to Goa, but that has to be sometime in the future.
I'll have to go in the future, yeah.
Thanks, Selina, for giving us your time and talking so nicely, so in such a coherent, simple manner about your book. We had quite a few people attend today's session. And thank you all for attending. And I just want to make a quick announcement. Emails will be going out to everyone who's been attending, including you, Selina. We have our next webinar. The International Center Goa is organizing its next webinar on 15th July with the Venerable Tenzin Priyadarshi, who heads the Dalai Lama Institute for Ethics at MIT. He'll be joining us for a session on 15th July at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time. I think that would be a better time for those from North America or even Europe. For Singapore, it will be just 2 hours, 2.5 hours later. Thank you so much, Salina.
Thank you so much, Pushkar, and thank you for the audience for attending.
Bye.